quick announcement. Off the back of this following discussion, we arranged a full online workshop with Andrew Holecek on the 4th of September, which you can find at adventuresinawareness.com. It's basically going to resolve the tension in this debate that we've had on this channel between is awareness empty of inherent existence? In other words, is consciousness something that arises dependent on other causes and conditions? Or is it, as some traditions say, fundamental to reality? So Andrew comes from a Tibetan Buddhist tradition that claimed to have resolved this debate, and he will offer meditations that allow an insight into both the empty nature of awareness and its luminous, ever-present quality. So I'm excited to find out more in this workshop, and I'm sure you'll be intrigued by the following discussion. You can find further information, as I said, at adventuresinawareness.com. So Andrew's full bio is in the description below, but he's both a scholar and practitioner, and I'd like to highlight that he's done a full 3-year meditation retreat in this Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and he's also invited by many labs who want to study meditators in advanced states of meditation or in lucid dreaming. He's written several books. He's a concert pianist. He's a trained dentist. So he's a very grounded, impressive and interesting person to speak with. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. And if you want to join the workshop, again, you can find us at adventuresinawareness.com.
I'm here.
Hi, Andrew.
You survived.
I did. Yeah.
How was the adventure? Are you?
Yeah, really good. It was a very interesting experience to just be so dependent on other people.
Yeah, just wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's humbling. It's healthy, I guess, in that regard, You start to realize that the kindness of others, how much we rely on others. So yeah, I'm glad you're through it, popped out on the other end. And I mean, again, I just had a unilateral and um I'm sure it was less than half of what you had to deal with, but you look good.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not through it yet, but
Yeah.
I'm at that awkward phase where I have to be, I feel fine until I do something unwise.
Yeah, like for me, it was like coughing and laughing. I mean, spontaneously, like, oh, you can tell it's still not fully mended.
Do you know Key and Peele by any chance? It's a comedy duo.
No, I don't. Does he ever riff on it?
They have a sketch where someone who laughs in a very strange way, they kind of just do this, but they don't make any noise. And I feel like I've become that character
Huh.
because, yeah, I'm
Yeah,
suppressing my laughter because it kind of
I know. I'll try not to crack you up.
try not to
That's
be too funny. Yeah.
we'll be we'll
No,
be super.
I've learned the art. I've gotten very good at feeling a tickle in my throat without coughing,
Yeah,
suppressing a sneeze. Yeah, the
yeah,
whole thing.
exactly. Yes, yeah, that's right. I forgot about sneezes. Those are pretty good too. It's like, whoa, oh, cool,
Makes you
excellent.
realize how powerful the diaphragm is.
Isn't it true?
Like a
It's a
punch. Boom.
Yeah, it's a big sleeve, and you start to realize the effects of these subtle body parts that you weren't aware of before.
It
Cool.
was easier before because I was just in pain all the time, and now I'm just in pain if I do something that pushes it. So I can
Yeah,
kind of forget it. I feel like, oh, I'm fine. Just get on with my life. And then until I push something a bit hard or lift something a bit heavy,
yeah, exactly.
but,
Yeah, yeah. Be
but it
careful with it.
seems to be going. I'm past the scary point.
Good deal. Good deal. So have you gotten fairly positive or okay feedback from the riff that we did with Michael and Bernardo et al.
Oh, that was a
On the,
while back. Yeah, I think so.
yeah.
Yeah, people loved that whole series of events. I've just made you co-host, by the way. If you're able to record to cloud, that will record to my Zoom cloud, I think, and just gives us a backup on the if we
Uh, how do I do that?
hopefully down the bottom right or something, there'll be a
Oh, it says
more
record. So simply just hit the record button.
yeah, and then there might be an option to hit record to cloud.
Oh yeah, got it. Record to cloud. Okay, got it. Double.
That just gives a backup. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's smart. That's really safe. Cool.
Yeah, the feedback on the engagement and that whole series of because I've had a few discussions now on
Yeah.
that topic. And when I scheduled Jay and Bernardo, I thought it was one of those things where it'll be me and five other people. It's really niche topic. No one's going to be that interested, but it's kind of perplexed me for a long time. Um, and then yeah, it was one of the most well attended
It
things
was a
I've put
rich
on, and
crowd. I sent it to a bunch of people. And yeah, I mean, Jay's brilliant, obviously. And he's so, no criticism whatsoever, but he's so classic Prasangika that, yeah, it was just a delight to bring in the other arm with Michael and Carl and participate in that. So thanks again for the opportunity. I think it's worth balancing out the complete Majamaka perspective. So.
yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to get more into that today.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely ties in. I mean, Prasangika versus Shentong. I mean, basically, we can refine it. In fact, we will. Prasangika is pretty much emphasizes the emptiness, the disparaged luminosity. In fact, in the traditional texts, some Gelugpa translators deliberately mistranslated luminosity. They basically edited it out. Basically, it's for Shentong is for those who don't have the guts to deal with the truth of the Prasangika. And then Shentong came along and said, you know, not so fast. You know, there's something, just like Bernardo said, he was so spot on, and Carl really nailed it. There's something there when you're done weed whacking. There's an indestructible, irreducible thing that you cannot cut. And that's the Shentong articulation. And that's luminosity, which is I think we'll see today is just as challenging to understand as emptiness is. I mean, we're talking about the reduction base of reality here. So it's going to be fun. Cool
you
stuff.
did you study? So Prasangika is a school of Tibetan Buddhism, and Shentong
Yeah,
is another school of Tibetan Buddhism. Is that right?
correct. Yeah. So there are,
And
the
and you
Madhyamaka.
studied both?
Oh, yeah, extensively. Yeah. So Prasangika, actually, Madhyamaka itself has two main arcs. One is what's called Rangtong, empty of self. That's literally what it means, self-empty. That's comprised of Svatantrika and Prasangika. And Prasangika is a little bit more advanced than Svatantrika, which is why that's where Jay was hanging his hat. And then you have the Shen Tong, other empty. That's Dolpopa's contribution. And we can talk a little bit about that because, as Michael pointed out, that's what he discovered in Dark Retreat. And so I can say a little bit about parenthetically, because otherwise, don't get me started on that baby. That's where the light, literally the luminosity of the mind, reveals itself without distraction. And it's no surprise whatsoever that that's where Dolpopa came up with the idea of Shentong,
Who?
because Dolpopa, Sheriff Gelson, he's the major Tibetan progenitor, originator of the Shentong view. And his insights, almost literally insights, came to him in Dark Retreat. When
What century was that again?
Late 1800s, so 19th century.
Okay. And Tsongkhapa was the great kind
Yeah,
of
he's the great
master
Gulu.
who originated
Exactly.
Prasangika.
Pretty much, yes. So he's the father. There's four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and he's the latest development is Gelugpa. That's the school that Dalai Lama because it basically leads. And so Tsongkhapa was the originator of that tradition. And so his contributions with Prasangika Madhyamaka are obviously enormous. But it goes back even farther, is Bernardo knows very well Nagarjuna or Nagarjuna, depending on who you talk to. He was the granddaddy of them all, and he actually talked about both schools. He talked about Prasangika, didn't use the term, but then he also very powerfully intimated Shentong. But somehow no criticism again to the Gelugpas, but they somewhat conveniently forget or disregard or don't pay attention to his kind of riffs on the great Majamaka Shentong. So it can be a little bit of a roadkill for people who aren't familiar with these terms. The terms themselves are somewhat daunting, and then really understanding these schools is quite something. It's not easy, but it's worth the lifting because this is the reduction base. I mean, Buddhism, in my definition, is it's not a belief system, it's a description of reality. And there are many different descriptions of reality depending on the schools. And arguably, the highest, most irreducible description of reality comes from the Dzogchen tradition. And they're the ones that talk about it. And this is what I want to riff with you about formally, the union of luminosity and emptiness, and what that really is. It's basically, you can't get any deeper than these two topics. The Buddha himself, he didn't come up with this classification of the three turnings. Historiographers, historians came back and retrofitted these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. And the first turning is all about cutting reality into pieces. The Abhidharma schools, the atomistic schools, basically, it's numbers. It's the numbers game. It's the five skandhas and the 12 nadanas and the 18 dhatus. I mean, it's just numbers, numbers, and the 51 samskaras. So it's all about cutting reality into these parts. And so that's really beautiful. But then the second turning comes along and says, well, even the parts don't exist. So the first turning is incredibly important. It's like physics, literally cutting down to atoms, that
Kind of
which is
classifying, naming.
exactly naming, articulating, parsing out the granularity, describing the pixelated nature of reality, which is super important. But then, like happens all the time, then they very easy to reify the parts. The near enemy of articulation is reification. And so then the Buddha turned the second turning, and um, this is all about emptiness. And this is allegedly when 500 arhats, his senior most students, all had heart attacks, right? Hence the Heart Sutra, the Heart Attack Sutra. The fundamental description of, not the fundamental, but one of the most succinct descriptions of the fundamental teachings on emptiness, where then the Buddha said, well, even the parts don't really exist. So everybody freaked out. And so 2/3 of the Buddha's teachings are devoted to the teachings on emptiness. It's massive. And then the third turning comes along, which again, some people don't subscribe to that. And the third turning is exactly what we talked about with Michael and Carl is, well, what's left when you're done cutting? There's something, it's just not a thing. It's this thing called luminosity. And so therefore understanding that is colossal. But the great contribution of Gelugpa, classic Prasangika, and therefore Jay's really brilliant exposition is the centrality of going through the cutting phase at first, cutting through to primordial purity. That's really super important because otherwise what happens is it's incredibly easy. And in fact, one way to talk about samsara is reified light. It's very easy to then reify luminosity, to reify awareness, which we can talk about. Super
Yeah.
easy to do that. And so therefore, the cutting part is critically important. Because if you don't have that, then you bring in the luminosity teachings. And this is what the Gelugpas rendered their attacks on with the Shentong saying, you guys just don't have the guts. You can't deal with the blazing, cutting truth of radical emptiness. So you posit this thing. Um, and that's where the big debate continues to this day,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's super rich. It's very cool.
And then some people have said, oh, the thing is, the whole Buddhist approach is not about metaphysics. You know, the story where the arrow gets,
Yeah,
someone gets hit by an arrow, and the Buddha's like, hey, look, if you get hit by an arrow, you're not going to be asking who made the arrow, where did it come from, what wood is it made of? You're just like, how do I get this arrow out? It's just about reducing suffering, and we'll leave metaphysics to other people. But you said earlier you do think it's a claim around the ultimate nature of reality. So
for
you,
sure. Well, that's what the alleviation of suffering fundamentally is. And this is really beautiful to kind of frame and start our riff because this stuff can appear at first pretty abstruse, philosophical, metaphysical. And I have to say at the outset, none of what I'm going to share is any of that. It's not philosophical, it's not theoretical. It's these teachings come from direct insight. These come from direct experience. And it's fundamentally all about exactly what you're hinting at, Amir, which is what the Buddha allegedly said so beautifully. I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. And so when you get into these topics that are so incredibly subtle, that's what makes them seem philosophical. And we can talk about how we can develop, refine qualities of mind, become like a really good, I'm sure your listeners know what phenomenology is. Meditators become really exquisite micro phenomenologists. They have the capacity to see, like I mentioned earlier, through deep meditation when the mind slows down. They see the atomistic nature, the pixelated nature of reality. They see it. It's called yogic direct valid cognition. It's the highest form of knowing. It comes from direct perception, yogacara. And then so these teachings, therefore, they're not theoretical. They're completely philosophical, completely applicable. And this is important. It's like, well, why should I be listening to this? Why bother? What's the point? Well, the point is subtle as this material is, subtle is not ineffectual. Everything we do in our gross lives is driven by extremely subtle processes, thoughts and emotions, and even prior to that, proto thoughts, proto emotions. And so the farther down we go to this reduction base, which is what we'll be talking about, the more we realize the extraordinary power of articulating these really profound, subtle, unconscious processes that basically dictate the entirety of our so-called conscious lives. And so understanding that, bringing that into the light of awareness, this is one way to talk about what liberation actually is. So we start to see the forces that basically buffet us around in life. So that's really important. It's not, and we mentioned this in the talk with Carl, Michael, and Bernardo, soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. This is intensely practical material. It's just super subtle. And then I'll point out in the time we have together through a handful of contemplations and practices, interjecting as we go through this material, ways to immediately practice this, ways to immediately bring it and actualize it into our lives. So we start to see it and experience, test the teachings against our own experience through these contemplations and practices, and have the same insight that Dolpopa and the Buddha and these other great masters did, who simply took the time to slow down, open, and then discover these fundamental processes. So it's really beautiful in that regard. The pedagogical approach here is really quite elegant. Hearing, contemplating, meditating, like I mentioned that previous podcast, ingest, digest, metabolize. So the teachings then become you. You walk the talk. They literally become a part of the matrix of your being.
Is it okay to ask a little bit about your background in terms of how
Yeah,
you,
sure, absolutely. Yeah, far away.
yeah. So because I read on your site, it's obviously our first time meeting one on one, and but I saw that you had studied some physics, that you studied extensively in Tibet, Nepal, India. You were a practicing dentist,
Yeah,
something
I agree. Everybody, that's commonplace, isn't it? Right? Anyway,
you found time to be a concert pianist. I don't know
yeah.
where that how that you just kind of dropped that in.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess I'm curious. Yeah, what I read is you, like many people, you had some dissatisfaction, some suffering. You were looking for through different religious texts and spiritual texts, and then found your home in the Tibetan tradition. Are you meta-conscious of what was it about that tradition in particular that was such a good fit for you?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to riff on that. Yeah, so what happened? So many things to say, but just very briefly, the first kind of before and after experience, major tectonic shift. I was an undergraduate degree at Indiana University doing a double degree in music, classical piano. I wanted to be a concert
Okay.
pianist, one of the
Wow.
best schools in America. And then because my whole family's in the medical, a dental world, I figured, well, I'm just interested in that, so I was doing a double degree in that in biology. And because I was type A overachiever, I fundamentally was diagnosed with symptoms of hypertension, dizziness, bloody noses, and that kind of thing. And so I went to the Health Science Center. They recommended all these things, altered diet and exercise and then medication. And I said, I'm 20 years old. I'm not going to medicate. And so at that point, this is a while back now. I remember reading some preliminary data coming from the TM, from the Transcendental Meditation community, about the effects of TM to work with things like high blood pressure. As it happens, there's a talk on campus. I went to it. I thought the guy was cool. I signed up. And long story short, within a 20-minute period of my first introduction to meditation, I entered a complete cessation, nirodha. I mean, my mind just completely stopped. And this was, for overachieving, hyper kind of cognitive kind of guy, this was a game-changing experience. I mean, it was like before and after. My life was changed on the spot. Complete, utter eradication of self, thought, everything just gone. Nirodha. And so my life changed. And then it was like, well, I came out of that a different person. Okay, like now what? Like, how do I stabilize it? Didn't find much of a path in TM at that point. I still have tremendous respect and allegiance to that tradition, and hence my deep affinity to Hinduism, from which that was born. I still, even though I'm a card-carrying Tibetan Buddhist, I playfully say it's mostly for tax purposes. I always remember the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, right? Christ wasn't a Christian. Buddha was just someone who woke up. And so then the next big thing, and then I'll pause, the next really kind of even bigger shift was when I finished my double degree 5-year program. I took a year off to figure out what to do. I wanted to go to med school. And I worked in as a surgical tech in a hospital. Then I worked the second half of that off year in a maximum security federal prison. And so it was a really gritty introduction to the underside of the human condition. And at the same time, Amir, I was studying the developing New Age. It wasn't named that, but the
Why
channel.
were you in working in the prison? That was
Well, it was just a job that came
oh,
up.
it's
I
okay,
figured
just
out,
by chance.
yeah, and so at that time I was studying Edgar Casey and Seth material. I actually had a correspondence with Jane Roberts, and I was really into that kind of stuff. And my meditation was my TM practice was continuing. And so basically, what happened was this extraordinary 2-week period where my mind just spontaneously just broke open.
And with the
And
TM stuff, did you continue to have, was that like a fluke, beginner's luck, cessation experience,
well,
or did you have
I
that
think
often?
yes, I think you could say it was fluke beginner's luck. You could also say it's karmically, I mean, somewhat predisposed to that.
But what I mean, was
Um,
it a one-off or was it like
oh
every
no, it's
week?
definitely not a one-off. Oh, absolutely not. No, no, no. It was a pointing out transmission that then I worked to stabilize and enhance.
Wow.
So the way the Buddhist thing came into play was I had this extraordinary experience. Basically for a period of about 2 weeks, all my dreams were lucid. This is why I'm so big into world of nocturnal meditation and lucid dreaming, doing studies with it, written 3 books on it. So all my dreams at night pretty much were lucid. What was super interesting, Amir, and this actually ties into the notion of emptiness, by the way, is my daytime experiences became more and more illusory. And so it was really, really kind of interesting, kind of cool. My dreams became more real, in a certain sense, reified. My waking reality became more unreal or dreamlike slash de-reified. And that was cool for about a week. And then it got hot. In other words, I didn't have the doctrinal underpinning. I actually had a premature immaculation. Pardon, I can't read this myself. I had a premature experience. So there's another pedagogical approach of understanding, experience, realization. I didn't have the understanding to relate to my experience. And after about a week, I said, I'm not getting enlightened here. I'm going insane because my reality was dissolving underneath my feet. And I basically started to freak out. And actually, what happened phenomenologically with that freak out may be worth talking about because it was indicative of what I discovered we're doing all the time anyway. And so I shut the whole thing down. Basically, I forced it out. I was working in the OR then. I basically jumped into my Volkswagen Beetle. I was living in Michigan. I drove out here to Colorado, which is where I now live, still live after 40 years, and playfully say I basically skied and drank my way back to reality. I don't know whether it was nature or the alcohol, I'm somewhat blank, that basically brought me back to whatever this is. But something had radically, irrevocably changed. Even though I kind of came back, it was like, well, wait a second, WTF was that? And then I entered a dark period of the soul, a dark night of the soul for many years. I didn't know where to go. Like, what do I do with this? And so I remember when I had this kind of breakthrough experience, it was somehow grounded in some understanding I had in my undergraduate study of physics. And so I figured, well, maybe I need to be a physicist, a quantum physicist. So I drove out here to Colorado, University of Colorado. I studied physics to substantiate or kind of flesh out my experience. After 3 years, I realized barking up the wrong tree. And then things got a little bleak. Like, what do I do now? So as it would happen in Boulder, where I live, the radical iconoclastic Siddha sage Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was here at the time. And so I started reading a little bit about that, studying about that, and was immediately
And
taken.
going to his meetings or
Well, interestingly enough, even though he was here, Amir, I never met him physically.
ah,
You could say I wasn't ready. I don't really know. But I still consider him my root teacher, this
mm,
Mahasiddha, crazy wisdom kind of guy. But and I'll pause after this, what really clicked it together, Amir, was the Buddha literally means the awakened one, etymologically, the one who is awake. That immediately caught my eye because part of my experience had to do with waking up. And so then I discovered, as I looked under the hood a little bit more, the tradition of dream yoga, let alone sleep yoga. And I just found myself nodding my head all the time. Geez, maybe I'm a Buddhist. And so, yeah, so since then, 40-year plus deep student of Tibetan Buddhism, did a 3-year retreat, still very, very active in it. But a really big important thing for me is no one has a patent on truth. I really believe in a non-sectarian approach to reality. So I study deeply Hinduism, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, Advaita Vedanta, um, a school in the Jewish mysticism called the Primordial Torah or the Kaduma Torah.
mm,
I'm a big student of that. And I'll find truth I'll take truth wherever I can get it. And
yeah.
then therefore, I'm a big fan of integral theory, um, working with philosophy, science, physics. I wouldn't say I'm a dilettante, but I like to just bring in all these supporting strands to help me understand my view. And so,
What does dilettante mean?
just a shopper, someone who just skims and takes a little bit of that and a
Oh,
little
right,
salad.
right.
I try not to be that, but I also try to be humble and open because I think one of the most um, challenging things, especially as we age, is maintaining a beginner's mind and an open mind, lest we think we know everything.
Yeah.
I love traditions, teachings, teachers that point out my blind spots, show me where I'm stuck, and rattle my cages. I love that. May not be comfortable for my order-seeking ego, but I find it very helpful to keep me honest and open and humble. So anyway, woo,
Yeah.
long-winded answer to my riff.
Amazing journey. And like obviously the 3-year retreats quite did you do that in the East
And
or
I did it. I did it in a place called Gampo Abbey in up Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. This exquisite retreat center around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that was another just massive experience for me. Actually, it was a really interesting type of 3-year retreat. It was 1 year in, 1 year out, which is brilliant. It was basically a 5-year retreat,
oh
and it was
wow.
brilliant because you were able to integrate the previous year's practices in real life, prepare for the next year, go back in, and so that remains the most tectonic shifting experience of my life. Where again, using this trifecta approach of hearing, contemplating, meditating. I'd been, studying and reading and prolifically. And I mean, my plate was so full, I realized I need to get this into my system. I don't need to learn anymore. We confuse information for experience in this age, this information age. I realized I need to go into retreat to literally incorporate these teachings. And therefore, one of the reasons I feel reasonably confident about the stuff I talk about is it does come from my experience.
Hmm.
And there's some certitude that comes from conviction that comes from seeing reality in the ways that maybe we'll be talking about. Um, this is the basis of what's called the Yogacara tradition that Jay referred to, sometimes conflated with Shantong. Yogacara means literally derived from yoga.
Hmm.
Like I alluded to earlier, these insights, they come from direct experience. Travelogues, these are guides coming back, so to speak, and sharing their stories of their direct experience. And what's so cool, this is the power of lineage and tradition. You realize that over thousands of years, similar beings that have similar journeys and experiences come back to share a very similar stories and renderings. And that's kind of cool. That means it's not just this radical postmodern relativism thing,
Yeah.
that there are particular patterns of replicability and things that we can follow. And that's really the beauty and the power of lineage, subscribing to that. So that's the dance between maintaining my allegiance to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and the power of lineage and transmission. But at the same time, the near enemy of that is ossifying the lineage, like I mentioned earlier. And I'm acutely
You
aware.
still have a teacher in the Tibetan?
I have multiple teachers at this point. My main teachers they've all passed. Trungpa Rinpoche, he put me in my 3-year retreat. My main teacher after I'm sorry, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was Khenpo Sultran Gyamtso Rinpoche. And we mentioned him in the dialogue, as did Swami Sarvapriyananda. He's the guy who wrote Progressive Stages of Meditation on
Oh, so he's
Emptiness.
a recent, he was
Ah,
okay, I
he
thought
died.
that text was maybe from an ancient source.
Oh, he died like 2 years ago.
Oh,
He was
okay.
a colossal influence. I studied with him very, very closely for many, many years. And so now I don't want to blind people with all these Tibetan names, but there's a number of really spectacular teachers that I still absolutely positively would call my teachers. But I'm not like officially in a Sangha or community, even though I have deep connections with many amazing masters. So yeah, I'm very blessed. My life has been very, very fortunate.
And then just one more question on the 3-year retreat, if that's okay. Would you have contact with your teacher like once a week, once a month, or just at the start of
Yeah.
the year?
Yes, good question. So it's a pretty heavy duty sequestered lockdown environment. I mean, shaved heads, robes, the whole thing. I mean, I'm a complete monk. And I have to say I loved it. It's like, well, I'm good at this. And that actually became somewhat interesting because on one level I didn't want to leave. It's like, wow, this is great. And then I learned later that that's a potential classical spiritual bypass maneuver, you know. And so when I was in the retreat, we're sequestered in a compound and then in a room. There were 10 of us, 5 men, 5 women. Doing it in a group situation is actually very important. You realize the brilliance of the maxim, you can't get enlightened without others. So you're basically naked in a hall of mirrors. And so you have all these others to reflect your projections, your neurosis. It's painful, but it's profoundly revelatory. And so the way it worked, Amir, is Trungpa Rinpoche he set the whole thing off, and then what happens? The other teachers would come in every 6 months because 3-year retreat. It's not you're not doing like one meditation. It's like going to meditation university. I probably did 60, 70 different practices. And it's another reason why the 5-year program is so great because there's so much coming so fast that it's really hard to digest and metabolize. And so they're called Kempos or lamas. They would come in every 6 months or so to give us instructions and teachings on the next set of practices. And then they come back again in 6 months and then they'd introduce the next ones. And it was by far the most precious opportunity experience in my life and also most painful. I wrote about it in my first book, The Power and the Pain, where I realized, especially the first 3 months, it was wickedly difficult. I realized about 3 months into it, it's like, why is this so bloody hard? Well, it's only as hard as I am. It was detox. It was a cultural, epistemological, and even ontological detox. And this is where I realized that everything in this conventional reality is a construct, space, time, causality, which co-emerge with a sense of self. That's the retinue of the sense of the self. These are all made up. They're constructs. And so then when I read in physics from likes of Nima Arkani Hamed and others, and Einstein even, hey, they're saying the same thing from a physical perspective. That's pretty cool. But when you go in and you actually, it all deconstructs, that's no small thing. Then you realize, how this happens moment to moment, day to day. And if you believe in this rebirth stuff, life to life. And so to have that exquisite container where you're held and you're fed and you're practicing, you're meditating 16 hours a day and you're sleeping in a meditation box. People always get tripped out on this one. I call it ego's coffin. It's a box that has 3 frames and it's open on the front. You sleep sitting up. And so there you then practice, and this is why I got so big in lucid dreaming and dream yoga. and then sleep yoga, you then develop the capacity, and Rupert talks about this quite beautifully in his breaths. You develop a kind of 24/7 awareness where you
Rupert
actually,
Spira or someone else?
yeah, Rupert Spira, yeah.
Yeah.
So you have the capacity. He writes about it in his book, The Nature of Consciousness, I think, and he speaks of it. It's really beautiful. You have the capacity to basically witness the construction and deconstruction of the self sense every single night when you fall asleep. It's beyond profound. You know, every night when you fall asleep, you see the self come undone. You maintain lucidity during this demolition derby. You see space-time causality come undone, and that's where the dream comes into play. That's why you can do all
Mm.
these amazing things in the dream because space-time causality are temporarily opened. Miraculous things happen. Then you maintain awareness even through that. You drop into full lucidity with the dreamless space. That's called luminosity yoga, connected to the term luminosity, also connected to yoga nidra. And then you're resting in deep, formless awareness, turiya in Hindu language, or dharmakaya, dharmata in Buddhist language. And so basically, you've died. You are gone. That's why we don't recognize it. Ego cannot attend its own funeral. So that's why we black out in deep dreamless sleep. But then it comes back up for reasons we can talk about if you want. And then you come back up, the dream reconstitutes, you wake up in the morning, the most contracted state, unquestionably looking back, saying to yourself, wow, I slept great. I had great dreams. No, you didn't. There was no you that fell asleep. There was no you that dreamt. There's no you that woke up. There's just various degrees of contraction and expansion on formless awareness itself. That's all there is. And so when you start to see that night after night after night, you don't think that's going to change the way you look at reality and your entire being. You realize the whole thing is made up. It's a vikalpa, construct, samskara. It's made up night to night, and then you'll see there's a very good microphenomenologist because when you're in retreat for so long, you get so open, you get so still, you get so quiet. It's like taking a movie reel, 16 to 24 frames per second. Not only do you slow it down, but eventually you stop it. That's the naroda part, cessation. And then from that, then you see how it cranks back up again. And you see that we literally, etymologically, we confuse reality together. Literally, it's called flicker fusion. We flicker fuse this reality based on the speed of our minds. And so when the mind slows down, everything falls apart. You fall apart, reality falls apart. And that's pretty revelatory, especially when you can see how it's taking place moment to moment. It's really this is the seed of both freedom and entrapment and confusion. So yeah, I mean, I can say so much more about it. It was beyond profound experience, Amir. It's just the greatest gift of my life, honestly, to spend
Well,
so much time in such an intense training
yeah,
environment.
sounds incredible. And was it after the 3 year retreat that you started going to India and Tibet and
Yes, exactly. So because of my background in dental surgeon, then I co-founded a charitable nonprofit foundation called Global Dental Relief. I started working in some of the monasteries. I went to Tibet, which was awesome. That's where I started, and then Nepal. So I worked in the monasteries of these great teachers who were teaching me. So I had a chance to give back. And selfishly, I got to spend a ton of time at the side of some amazing beings. And that I cannot tell you the great gift that is to be around masters who live and breathe this view of reality, and this is just the way they operate in the world. So
yeah.
yes, that was a tremendous gift.
Yeah, that segues me to a question that I really wanted to ask, which is a bit sensitive, but
No, no,
um,
cool. All right.
so I'll give the background to it, which is I used to do a lot of Argentine tango. And when I started, I couldn't tell the difference between an intermediate dancer and an advanced dancer. Everyone just looked impossibly incredible. And then, I had a lot of great teachers from Europe and USA. But after a few years of doing it, my discernment increased. I started to recognize the uncomfortable fact for me as someone not from Argentina. There's lots of teachers from and dancers in Argentina who are not that great. It's just a very large pyramid. But at the very top of the world pyramid, the very best teachers, the very most innovative dancers, the best dancers, 90, if not 95% of them are Argentinian. They're from Argentina. They're from the land where they grew up living and breathing it and hearing the music and the rhythms. And anyone can learn it and anyone can get very, very good at it. I think I got quite good at it. Um, and so, I'm more, and so sometimes I wonder because I'm more of a beginner in the, let's say, meditation, contemplative world. But I just sometimes wonder, okay, there's all these amazing Western teachers who I've had the privilege to learn from. But I do also sometimes wonder, oh, I wonder if like the very whatever that means in this world, best or accomplished or living and breathing it or imbued in the ancient tradition of whatever this is, are probably actually in Tibet or in Nepal or in the lands where this tradition originates from. Yeah, so without meaning to take away anything from all the really accomplished Westerners that are diving into this now, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I do. Excuse me. And I think what you say is cautiously true. I'm going to say cautiously because if we um, get too caught up in that, we dismiss the capacities that we have. And so I want to say a little bit more about that because perhaps one of the things that we can talk about as we go forward is the utter immediacy and applicability of what I really hope to talk to you about when we get into the deeper end of the pool. But there is something, when you go to these cultures, especially Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and there's others, of course, but these are the kind of traditional Tibetan or Vajrayana tantric approaches. There's definitely something to be said about these holding environments where you have cultures that are just designed, especially in Bhutan. They're all about gross na national happiness, for instance, in Bhutan, right? When you have a tradition that's living for thousands of years, there's absolutely power to how that lineage tradition stamps the environment and a culture. And there's definitely something incredibly supportive around that. There's no doubt about it.
It's kind of like going to Harvard or going to MIT.
Exactly.
You're just
Exactly.
immersed in that environment and everyone's obsessed with it. And that's
Exactly. It's like going
everyone's
to a
talking about it. Yeah.
the center of gravity is just so high that you can't help but have be grabbed by the collar and brought up to this incredibly lofty center of gravity that is transegoic, transpersonal. And in the so-called West, and obviously with globalization, these boundaries are breaking down. We have a similar center of gravity, but it's mostly egocentric. It's mostly wake-centric. So that you still get brought up, but picked up by the collar and brought up to this particular center of gravity. But then when you try to go beyond, well, that same force takes that collar and holds you down. And so therefore, this is why the power of community and Sangha is so important because you're just a whack job in the West. If you're not abiding by the traditional Cartesian or Aristotelian dualistic ways of looking at mind and reality, you're a flake. It's woo-woo, you're new age. And this is by the way, parenthetically, way I admired the courage of Bernardo so much. He has the courage, Christoph Koch, by the way, similarly, to follow the data, to follow the truth. Federico Fagin, the same thing. The peeps that you talk about, I admire them so much because they have the courage to step outside of the paradigm, outside of the box, and don't worry about people dragging them down. But what you say is important. Trungpa Rinpoche once said something about this. It was really humbling and beautiful. He said, you guys need to understand that I'm not like you. I was born in this culture where everything was about the Dharma. I was in a monastery from age 3. Everything was about meditation and kindness and compassion and wisdom and training. I'm not like you. You guys have to work, I'm paraphrasing, you have to work against the forces of the dark side here. You've got all these co-conspiratorial agents that are basically working against the trajectory of awakening past egoic structure. And that's really important to recognize. This is why there's so few enlightened beings in the West. Even though the immediacy of awakening is literally right in front of us, stability is the issue. And so, because we don't have this cultural holding environment, this milieu, this mandala, this container, the word dharma is so interesting. Amir, I'm a big fan of word origins, etymology.
Me too.
Dharma comes from a root, Sanskrit root, dhr, which means to hold in two senses. One, as in hold, as in cease, the cessation aspect, And then also hold as in contain, like mandala. And so we don't have the same holding environment. And therefore it is more challenging for us in the West because of that. And so therefore it's helpful provisionally to go to the so-called East or to these monasteries and whatnot. That's why I did my retreat. That's why I spent so much time in Asia to train in these ideal markets, so to speak. But then the point, and again, but there's also a near enemy there because if you get a little bit too cozy in this holding environment, Trungpa Rinpoche nailed this with his term spiritual materialism 60 years ago. John Wellwood picked it up with his term spiritual bypass. Then you just get high on meditative cocaine, metaphysical Valium. You're just basically hanging out in your kind of spiritual God realm.
And is that recognized in those monasteries, in those cultures?
No,
Like, oh, you can end up bypassing.
no. And this is again the great contribution of globalization in integral approaches. Everybody has their blind spots. And I have to be very cautious here because I have such tremendous allegiance towards these wisdom traditions. But we don't see what we don't see almost by definition. And if you want to go along this sidebar track, which is incredibly important, the difference between states and structures of consciousness, the Eastern traditions emphasize states. They know virtually nothing about structures because they don't have the data acquisition systems to understand structures of consciousness. And so, just very briefly, these are our paradigms, these are our worldviews, these structures of consciousness. We don't look at them, we look through them. So they're archetypal blind spots. And so I've discovered, spending a lot of time in the East with these great masters, and I won't say the masters themselves, but the communities, there's a heap of blind spot activity going on there. They have their own fundamental reductions, which are not healthy. Like, for instance, in the West, pathological reductionism in the pejorative sense is reducing everything to what my dear friend Ken Wilber talks about. Everything is the play of frisky dirt. Isn't that a great line? It all comes down to just materialism. Like, no way. Well, the East, which criticizes that, they have their own blind spots. And again, with complete awareness of limits of what I might be saying here, one of them is reducing everything to karma. Oh, the reduction base, everything brought up in the phenomenal world is reducible to karma. No, it's not. Just because karma is based on causes and conditions, for sure. Everything that arises in the phenomenal world is based on causes and conditions. And so it's therefore easy to conflate that everything is due to karma. It's not. But even the Buddha, and again, for some reason they forget, just very briefly, the Buddha talked about what are called the five niyamas, or the five orders of reality, of which karma niyama is just one. Briefly, you have Utu niyama, which is basically analogous to physics. You have Bija niyama, which is basically analogous to biology, genetics. You have Chitta niyama, which is basically psychology. Then you have what's called Dharma niyama, which is the causality, but kind of correlative to Buddhist principles and teachings, or perennial teachings, I should say. And then you have karma niyama, causation that is based upon behavioral causation. And so, for some reason, these other four are not that well known. In fact, I asked, somewhat gently challenged some Tibetan teachers in public settings around this, and they didn't know what I was talking about. And I was like shocked.
Mm.
So I think this because, yes, your point is a good one, that there is something to be said about going into these environments, but then there's also near enemies. There's traps to that.
Mm.
You can get stuck on either.
And then I guess it's a good moment to just get a sense of your, so that's brilliant. Kind of got a vague, obviously potted, vague sense of your background. Um, and what's your sense of the goal of Dharma? And is it the same? Is it universal? Is it the goal of life?
Boy, that's a really big one. I would say yes, I think it is. Um, yeah, the goal, I mean, this is such a huge topic, right? Philosophy, metaphysics, spirituality, psychology, everybody's wrestled with this for thousands of years. So I'm going to now answer it in 30 seconds. Yeah, the goal is fundamentally to wake up to the nature of mind and reality and help others. I mean, really, um, that's it. Sometimes called twofold benefit. Ultimate benefit for self and others. Ultimate benefit for self, I playfully put it this way, is realizing there isn't one. That's emptiness. And then ultimate benefit for others is cluing people into this fundamental truth, waking them up to that truth. And this has to do with this narrative of luminosity, the play of the emptiness. So yes, I would say, power of open question, I will gladly be corrected. That seems to be the goal of Dharma, because Dharma, I think, is fundamentally a description of reality. And therefore, I think it is, you could say, the telos, perhaps, if we're careful, of life reality itself. But this is, all right, we could talk about this and we will,
Yeah,
for
obviously,
hundreds.
but just very kind of very top level, you see that as embedded in reality itself. That's based on observation of this is what reality seems to be doing, of moving consciousness towards awakening and a reduction in suffering, and therefore you're inferring, I guess that's the purpose of reality, the purpose of life. I'm getting on board with what life's trying to do. Am I reading too much into what you just said?
Yeah, well, almost, because, and this is where languaging becomes fairly, very subtle, very granular, and somewhat problematic. The minute you bring in the ideas of purpose, telos, and that sort of thing, again, the traditions, depending on who you talk to, will say otherwise. Because on one level, it's just the sport of it all. It's just the play of it all. Lila in Tibetan, rolpa I'm sorry, Lila in Sanskrit, rolpa in Tibetan. It's all just the self-organizing play of reality. And so there's a difference. It's a subtle difference, but there's a difference between play and purpose, play and competition. What makes play is precisely because there is no purpose. There is no telos. You're doing it just for the F of it. That's what makes it so delightful. And that's why when people wake up to the nature of reality, one characteristic of that awakening is tremendous playfulness and carefreeness and a childlike, not childish, a childlike wondrous relationship to the nature of reality. It's just like um, one big delightful, never-ending super tango dance, right? You're just doing it. You don't do tango for unless you're in competition. You're not heading or racing for a deadline. You're doing it just for the sheer delight and immersion of the display. And so purpose and telos, these are I'm cautious here, open question. These are perhaps conceptual imputations in an attempt to understand the ineffable play of reality. We bring these things into the picture. Um, is the purpose about developing the universe becoming aware of itself metacognitively? Is that part of it? Or is it just this unfolding, breathtaking, uh, inarticulate unfolding of the nature of things? This is why the Zen tradition talks so beautifully about the
What's
don't know.
what do you have an opinion on that, or a center of gravity of where you
Around what? I'm sorry, Amir. Around what particularly?
like if there's a purpose or it's all just play? If
Well, you know what? Here's another way to look at it. Why can't it be both? So this is another really wondrous way of looking at things daimonically. You know the work of Patrick Harper, right? I mean,
yeah,
looking at the reality through daimonic lens, through a dialetheist lens, a non-Aristotelian lens. And so why can't it be both? And just because Aristotle said you have to follow these articulate ways of looking at things, I personally, reality is so much bigger than we can imagine. And I think there's so much room on this table for both these views. On one level, yes, it's just the celebratory play and delight and shine. I mean, that's third turning teachings are about how to shine properly, how to radiate and play and be luminous properly. And so, on one level, does that out-contextualize and supersede the possible purpose in teleology? I don't know. I'm okay. Dialetheism, you know what that is? That's the capacity to hold two opposing views at the same time. Jung talked about it. You see this in the work of Niels Bohr. I think it was Bohr. Complementarity. Light can be both wave and particle. Who says it can't be both? Aristotle, the Greeks, some of them
yeah,
anyway. So why not both? My room. my table is big enough to have both these guests.
Yeah, I guess the practical application of that, because it comes back to this question I had around, oh, is the kind of, are the more realized beings, are the higher teachings, is the most conducive environment in the East? And one lens would be, well, if the purpose of life is to transcend the ego, to see through these kind of constrictive narratives, then yeah, then ideally we want to either go to the East or bring the East to the West. Whereas if one took the view that was more, well, reality is a kind of vivacious play and expressing lots of different ways of life and lots of different ways of being, then there's something beautiful happening in the East, and also there's maybe something beautiful, and I agree, it's not necessarily geographical anymore, but this Western thing of like, okay, we're kind of glorifying the ego, and then there's pockets of people who are seeing something beyond the ego, but then bring it back down to this egoic relational live stream thing, and
Beautiful.
that's equally as beautiful and amazing and to be
Absolutely.
celebrated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you're intimating, these are beautiful questions. So you're intimating several important things. One is the path of freedom, not versus, but in conjunction with the path of fullness. And so you could almost say, again, I'm so careful with these massive orienting generalization statements. You could almost say that spirituality in the so-called East is about the path of freedom, emptiness. And the West is about the path of fullness, the extraordinary effulgence of these disciplines and these systems and these traditions of knowledge. And I mean, it's just why can't you have both? Um, and so, oh, there was something else in there you said that caught my mind and it just escaped me. Oh, yeah. So, ego. So, this is also really important that there's nothing just this has to do with structures of consciousness, developmental structures. And this is, by the way, a small criticism I have of what I see in the hardcore non-dual traditions, Advaita Vedanta. And again, so much respect. And who am I to say whatever? But I am saying I think there are some limitations because there isn't a full overt recognition of developmentalism, structuralism, the unfolding of structures of consciousness. And so this is important because what is ego? Ego is just a structure. It's a form of arrested development. We need the ego, Amir. If we didn't have the ability to separate self and other, we would not be sitting here talking about the nature of self and other. As I playfully say, we'd be a chicken McNugget in the Serengeti. You know, you need to be able to defend yourself against so-called exogenous phenomena. And so our immune systems wouldn't work if we couldn't do that. Ego is incredibly important on the developmental path. Unfortunately, what happens is it becomes a type of developmental imperialism. It basically dismisses and colonizes and just gets frozen, stuck. So ego is just constipated development. So what happens in the growth trajectory, Hegel was onto this with this dialectic, is a transcend but include journey. This is really important. So when you grow, you don't get rid of the ego. It's like getting rid of age 4. You transcend but include it. You always have access to ego, just like you always have access to act like a 4-year-old. But as an adult, you have a better view. You have a better way of relating to the world. And so it's exactly like you say, you have these trans-egoic spiritual experiences. Well, if you just hang out in the penthouse of development in this way, again, that's classic spiritual bypassing. This is Turiya. This is the near enemy of the Turiya approach. Well, I'm just going to retreat to the ultimate witness and hang out there. It has tremendous provisional validity. But the great contribution, as you know, from non-dual Shaiva Tantra is Turiyatita. Turiya is the fourth, meaning it goes on beyond waking, dreaming, and sleeping, the fourth state. Turiyatita is the fifth. It doesn't mean there's a fifth state. It means you take the insights of the four, and then especially Turiya, and then you bring it back into the world. See, you bring the insights back to egoic structure, back voluntarily into form, into speech, into action. And this is the great gift for me, why I so much adore non-dual Shaiva Tantra / Kashmir Shaivism. They riff on this in a really elegant way. So I think this is important because then what do you have? You have this wonderful conjunction and concert, cross-pollination between Eastern, so-called Eastern, and so-called Western approaches to psycho-spiritual development. Because if you just put all your eggs in one or the other basket, you're limiting yourself. And this is why I see, let me just share one really appropriate, or I should say applicable um, example of this. I teach a lot around the world these days. And this is no exaggeration. I'll go back to places I've been like 10, 20 years. And the person I talked to 20 years ago comes up to me and they have a particular problem. And I suggest, well, maybe you want to consider doing, maybe some therapy or something like that. Step outside the meditative box, get some help. They come back 20 years later, exactly the same problem. And I politely say, well, what have you done? Well, I went to my meditation instructor and they said, well, you need to meditate harder. You need to meditate more. No, you both need therapy, right? Right. So if you put all your eggs in one basket, I mean, good luck. Um, Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, the teachings on emptiness, for instance, theoretically, they can handle everything for sure. But in reality, it doesn't seem to work that way because of the power of habit, the power of
Is that
karma.
just for, yeah, did you meet uh, beings, people in the East for whom the emptiness did fully work? Did they, or did you still feel like, I think like they could all have benefited from a little bit of therapy? And I know you have to put aside some humility to like even have that judgment, but um,
Well, let me give you some examples. Again, I'm so cautious here. Who am I? Who am I to say this? But let me
well,
just
you've
give you,
got, several decades of experience. You've seen both
yeah,
cultures,
yeah.
it's just your personal opinion, but
Well, again, I want to
an
be careful.
important one.
I'm not going to name names. But you don't have to scratch too far below the surface in the spiritual biz. Any tradition defines scandal, power abuse, sex abuse. It's everywhere.
Mm,
And I hate to say it, it's going to continue forever
mm,
until people understand the difference between structures and states of consciousness. And so I don't have to have been at the side. And I have witnessed some things that were pretty eye-opening to me that were like, wait a second, this just does not compute. And I have to say, Amir, for the longest time, it put me into a little bit of a tailspin because I thought the spiritual path, the path of freedom, it's a dangerous word these days, could trump everything. It basically could supersede everything.
mm,
And again, in theory, theoretically it can. I mean, if you understand the empty nature of everything, it basically can handle everything. But in reality, it doesn't seem to. So you can read about it. I won't name names, but endless um, scandals, abuse. What is going on there? These are people that have high, high levels of state realization, relatively stable in that vertical. Actually, no, that would be a horizontal vector. This is the difference between waking up and growing up, or the difference between vertical and horizontal enlightenment. You can look at them at two different axes. They're pretty darn awake on one level, but unless they remain in complete silence and don't do a thing, say a thing, the minute they move, say, or do anything, they have no choice but to express their state level of realization through their structural level of development. They have no choice. And that's where the crap hits the fan because they have a lofty, amazing state experience of Turiya, Dharmakaya, whatever you want to call it. They then filter it through whether they know it or not. That's why these filters, blind spots are so damaging. And they do all the crazy, hurtful, painful things they do. How can you possibly explain this without using something like these two vectors of development? And so this is one reason why, like I mentioned half an hour ago, while yes, spirituality is like my main thing. I mean, I've 30,000 hours of meditation, right? And it's like my main thing, but it is definitely not my only thing. Now I'm working with things like IFS. We had some conversation behind the scenes about that, my
mm,
dear friend Dick Schwartz.
mm.
It's a brilliant way to bring blind spots into view. So yeah, I'll pause there. Yeah, I won't name names, but you don't have to look very far to see these scandals. And I'm telling you, it ain't gonna stop. It's just not gonna stop if people put all their eggs in one of these vectors or another. And so this is why I think an integral, open-minded, systemic approach to human development to me is so critically important.
Well, to me, it's one of the exciting potentials with these teachings becoming increasingly adopted in the West, and people like you having this perspective of, oh, maybe there was something missing, and there's other vectors that need to be addressed, and can we create communities and teaching structures that are a little bit less hierarchical, that hold people to account.
Beautiful.
It's an exciting because who knows if we manage to keep this going for 200 or 300 years, maybe we will have very teachers who have realized things to a very high degree, who are embedded in community, societal, moral structures where there's less of the relational harm being done. Maybe it won't be eliminated, but it'll be less. So that would be
100%.
my optimistic hope. But um,
You said one thing, you said one term here that let me just say a tiny bit, one word on this. You mentioned the word hierarchy. This is so important. This again, the granularity here, the precision of languaging in the usage of these terms in a more I don't know, I guess integral systemic approach. There's a difference between what are called actualization hierarchies and dominator hierarchies. So when we think about a hierarchy, are you talking about a dominator hierarchy? Are you thinking about what we usually think of a hierarchical approach, right? The top-down thing where the top suppresses, right? Dominates the down. Well, actualization hierarchies still are hierarchical. I have no hesitation to say that the Dalai Lama is a more evolved being than I am, right? I consider that this is healthy hierarchy. This is a hierarchy of a parent, a good parent, doing good parenting. And this is why structuralism, developmentalism in the West is so critically important because there are hundreds, no exaggeration, hundreds of developmentalists, going back to James Mark Baldwin, William James, all the way up to the present, that have unequivocally cross-culturally articulated anywhere from 6 to 12 or so developmental levels. These are hierarchical in nature, but they're not necessarily dominator hierarchies, they're actualization hierarchies. So when I'm at the feet of a real meditation master, I surrender. I open to that actualization. This being knows more about me. And really, one of the biggest things when I was with these amazing people for years on end, I just came out of every one of these sessions with them, or most of them, saying, I want to be like this person, right? I want to live with such openness and humility and kindness and compassion. So, just a real brief riff on the difference of these two forms of hierarchy. I think it's important to understand.
yeah. Are you, if you see me looking this way, I've just got some notes that I wrote before so I wouldn't forget. Are you familiar with Rob Bear's
I
teachings?
am. I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My friends who are big fans of Prasangika situate him as like very Prasangika. Is that just because they're looking through a Prasangika lens, or would you agree that?
That's a good. I'd have to. It's been a long time since I've looked at Hip-Hop's work, so I'm very cautious about that. Amir, if I had a chance to, I have some of his books. It's been a while since I really looked at his stuff, so I'm hesitant to say with any
Mhm.
clarity around that.
Um, and then to come back to cessation, I've spoken to a few people now about cessation. Um, do you know Ruben Laukkanen's
Dear
work or
friend,
approach?
Ruben's a dear friend. I interviewed him on my, excuse me.
If you need a moment to clear your throat or get some water, that we can
Yeah,
pause. Don't. Yeah.
let's do that. Let's
Yeah.
take 2 seconds. I have to go to the bathroom anyway. And then,
Okay.
yeah, I want to talk about Naroda Samapati, Ruben's work, because this cessation thing is really interesting. The difference between Nirvana and Naroda. So let me take a 2 minute break and then we'll
Yeah.
continue.
And then I think we've got really good context to ask you about the J. Bernardo idealism versus
Yeah, well, but
intensity.
honestly,
Yeah.
that's the boy, there's so much to say
Great.
on it.
Okay.
So
Let's take a minute.